This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. I recently did a video on Jeremiah Bannister, who also goes by the name Paleocrat. In this video, I want to refute the many errors he makes in his recent video called Rejecting Sedevacantism. The other video I did focused on the personal problems with Jeremiah. I want to stick to the theological errors that he is promoting in his recent video, in this video. I'm going to have to move quickly because there are a lot of them. The first one I want to talk about is his statement that Sedevacantism is radically autonomous. That's one of his reasons for rejecting it. It's interesting that he would use the phrase radically autonomous because that is synonymous with autocephalous. They both mean independent or self-governing. And in fact, the word autocephalous is usually used to refer to the schismatic Eastern, quote, Orthodox churches, which are independent of the popes throughout history and they operate on their own authority. And so it's ironic that in describing his reasons for rejecting Sedevacantism, he rejects the, quote, radical autonomy when we have Benedict XVI, who has made joint declarations with the leaders of these autocephalous or autonomous sects and churches and proclaim them to be in the Church of Christ and even pastors in the Church of Christ. And so by using that argument, you actually condemn yourself out of your own mouth. If you're condemning autonomy, you should be first in line. You would have to be first in line to condemn Benedict XVI as a heretic who promotes the most radical autonomy possible. He's the man who claims to be Pope, yet endorses, praises, and in fact declares to be within the body the most autonomous schismatics in the world. Yes, we are opposed to radical autonomy, and that's precisely why, as Catholics, we must reject the papacy-rejecting, autonomous, schismatic endorsing heretic Benedict XVI. The next error that I want to cover is that you condemn the, quote, hermeneutic of Sedevacantism as relativistic. You say that the Sedevacantist standard could be drawn on by any heretic, and that, in fact, the Arians could have said the same thing and declared that the Roman pontiff was not the Pope and lost his office without declaration, and in fact, you say, they would have had a stronger argument than the Sedevacantists because there were more of them. Now, this is completely illogical and wrong. The first premise of your argument fails completely. What is the standard of the Sedevacantist by which he determines that Benedict XVI is a heretic and therefore cannot be Pope? It is on the basis of dogmatic definitions and ecumenical councils. Now, let's think about this. Were the Arians appealing to established dogmatic text promulgated by Roman pontiffs and ecumenical councils from the past? No, they weren't. They were promoting their own heresy based on their own understanding of Scripture and their own theological analysis. They were not quoting councils promulgated by the Roman pontiff and approved by the Roman pontiff. They were not quoting dogmatic definitions emanating from the Holy See. And so the analogy fails miserably. The two standards are not the same. It's also further absurd because you say that the Arians would have had a greater argument than the Sedevacantists. Well, you're just saying this to please the itching ears of the heretics who want you to attack Sedevacantism because you can't really believe that. You just spent 6 months condemning the Vatican II Church as totally apostate and heretical. So according to your own argument, you would have to say that in the last 6 months you have embraced something that's worse than Arianism. And if you did that, and were so convinced it's correct, and yet nothing really has changed except your own doubt, why should anyone have any confidence in what you say now? And so no, the standard is not the same. The standard, the rule, the hermeneutic that a Sedevacantist employs in recognizing that Benedict XVI is self-condemned, is the very standard the Church gives us. The magisterial rule of faith. The canons, as the Council of Trent says, are given to us so that we may judge everything by that standard. They are a rule. That's what canon means. So you're completely wrong. Your argument's completely illogical. And in fact, your hermeneutic is relativistic. Because, as St. Francis de Sales says in the Catholic Controversy, if the Council of Trent, for instance, can define an article, and someone else has to understand it and interpret it, and that understanding becomes the formal and binding rule, then it can always be revised, and it's endless. And a good example of this would be that according to your hermeneutic, you would have to say that the joint declaration with the Lutherans on justification is the proper understanding of the Council of Trent, because it would be employing a, quote, false hermeneutic to base your understanding on the text of the Council of Trent itself. You have to go by what the, quote, living authority says about the Council of Trent. So you should adopt faith alone and that the canons of Trent no longer apply. As the heretical joint declaration, approved by JP2 and Benedict XVI, and, quote, promulgated by the Catholic Church, as they say, declares. The next error that I want to cover concerns Pope Pius XII's decree on papal conclaves Vacantis Apostolicae Sedis, 1945. Pius X had a similar decree, and you use this as an argument to supposedly contradict Sedevacantism. The key passage is that none of the cardinals may in any way or by pretext of any excommunication, suspension, or interdict whatsoever, or any other ecclesiastical impediment, be excluded in the active and passive election of the Supreme Pontiff. And you say that this refutes the notion that a cardinal under excommunication for heresy couldn't be elected pope. This is completely wrong. First of all, you don't seem to realize that there are major and minor excommunications. Heresy is a major excommunication. However, people can automatically, ipso facto or late sententiae, incur automatic excommunications for things other than heresy. For example, a cardinal who falsified relics or violated a cloister would be automatically excommunicated. However, those excommunications would not separate him from the church. They would put him in a state of grave sin, but he would still be a member of the church. He would be forbidden to participate in the church's sacramental life. Those are called minor excommunications, and you can see that, in fact, people are excommunicated for those things in Canon 2326 of the 1917 Code and Canon 2342. Now, a cardinal who publicly defects from the faith, as Canon 188.4 teaches and Divine Law teaches, automatically is expelled from the church and is no longer a cardinal. He loses all dignity in the church. And so cardinals under excommunication cannot be public heretics, because a cardinal who is a public heretic is no longer a cardinal. And so the fact that these individuals are described as cardinals presupposes that they are not public heretics. And so Pius XII's decree is not dealing with public heretics at all. He's dealing with people who are cardinals yet labor under a lesser excommunication. He is most certainly not saying that public heretics can be elected pope. The notion is at war with all of Christian theology. Heretics are outside of Christian communion. You cannot have a heretic leading the Christian church. It's basic Christian theology. That's why theologians such as Coronata and others teach that heretics could not be elected pope. The Catholic Encyclopedia says the same thing, and they are simply repeating the divine law on this point. The notion is completely opposed to the unity of the church. In addition, what further puts a nail in the coffin of this argument, let's grant for the sake of argument what the non-sedevacantists are saying about this decree on papal conclave. Let's say, okay, it's talking about public heretics and it's suspending their excommunication so that they can be elected pope. Well, a point they overlook is the very next line, which says this, quote, "We hereby suspend such censures solely for the purposes of the said election. At other times, they are to remain in vigor," end quote. Very interesting. It says that this decree only applies for the purpose of the election. And then the censure or excommunication immediately comes back into force. And so if we grant for the sake of argument, what they're saying is wrong, but let's grant it for the sake of argument that it's talking about heresy, well, they would fall under the excommunication automatically and be expelled from the church immediately after the election. And so they would lose their offices immediately or shortly after the election. And so the decree proves nothing for them. The next significant error you make is you cite Canon 1557 and 1558 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law. They state that the Roman Pontiff has the power to judge and that to him alone belongs the right to judge cardinals. Well, this is completely irrelevant and misapplied. This is dealing with trials. You can look at these canons. They are under the subsection on trials in general. And so it's talking about how a Roman pontiff alone can preside over the trial of a cardinal. That has nothing to do with this issue whatsoever. The divine law and canon law at work in proving that publicly heretical, quote, cardinals and, quote, popes lose their offices or cannot be recognized as valid teach that it occurs without any declaration or trial. There is no trial, because by manifesting his heresy, he condemns himself and excludes himself from communion. And the Catholic recognizes that the heretical quote cardinal and the heretical quote pope have placed themselves outside the church in the same way that he recognizes that the leading schismatic has placed himself outside the church, or the Protestant minister has placed himself outside the church. No trial is necessary. So this is completely irrelevant and misapplied. And in fact, if a trial were necessary to conclude that such individuals were outside the church, the external unity of the faith would crumble and be a fiction. The last thing I'll say is, you say Sedevacantism is anti-hierarchical. No, Benedict XVI is. He declared that the evangelical Protestants who don't have a valid hierarchy have a, quote, saving Eucharist. That comes from his book, Pilgrim Fellowship of Faith. So he says that you can have a saving Eucharist and salvation, and even be part of the Church of Christ, without being in communion with the hierarchy, and without even having a valid hierarchy.